Awesome. All right. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today. My name is Michael Mendez. I'm the program director of the Cook County Small Business Source Program, and I'll go into a little bit more detail of what that is today. We have a fantastic topic to cover today, which is the Corporate Transparency Act and beneficial ownership information reporting that comes along with it. But before we get started on today's topic, I just want to take a quick second here and talk a little bit more about what the Cook County Small Business Source Program is. Right, so the Cook County Small Business Source Program is a boots on the ground oriented program that goes out into the neighborhoods and talks person to person, virtually over the phone with entrepreneurs and small business owners, much like yourselves. And we're here to provide no cost business advising to entrepreneurs and small business owners. So that's only one factor of it, right? The one-on-one business advising. We also dabble in educational opportunities, much like today's session, right? Covering topics that are very important and critical for a business success, whether it be areas of marketing, operations, and legal issues like this. And on top of that, we also are amongst a group of 19 different business support organizations, such as the Women Business Development Center, Allies for Community Business, that all have different areas of focus. So when you come to the source, you're also coming to an entire network that's here to support you. So I don't want to take any more time from today's presentation. We have a wonderful guest speaker today, Noeli Serna, who has been a great partner to the Illinois Hispanic Chamber of Commerce for many years now, who's going to take a little bit more time to explain more about the Corporate Transparency Act and the BOI reporting. Oh, sorry, Noeli. All yours.
Thank you, Michael. So we're sharing our screen. So I'm controlling Michael's screen and we're going to test and see if this is working, and it is. All right. So good morning. Thank you to you, Michael, to the IHCC for having me here with you this morning. Thank you all for joining us. I do agree. This is a really important topic. It's new. There are potential ramifications of not knowing about this for your business and not acting according to the law. So I'm excited to come here today, explain what this new requirement is, and then of course help you make sure that you're complying with it as well. So before I dive into kind of a high level of what our topics are today, I do want to take a second to mention that we do have a chat function here. So I encourage anybody that has questions, ask them throughout the presentation. I would request that you send those questions via the chat. I will be monitoring it. It's up in front of me. So that's going to be my way of pausing and hopefully answering questions as they come up, which I think is always more helpful and relevant so that we don't have to come back to topics that may be a little bit further from our minds down the presentation. All right, so all of that administrative piece being said, excited to talk about a few points here. So today's topics, right? So overall, I think what we're going to be talking about is what is the Corporate Transparency Act, right? And exactly who and what businesses, what legal entities are actually impacted by it. Beyond that, if we come to the realization after this presentation and that portion of the presentation that you are potentially a business owner or have a legal entity that is impacted by this law, we want to make sure you understand, of course, how do we comply, right? Where do we have to go to file the information that the government is requesting of us? What are the steps that we do need to take? And then last point here, we're going to dedicate some time to explaining why do we need to do this, right? And if we do not do this according to the law, what are the potential consequences to us and to our businesses as well? So high level, these are the topics that we'll be discussing today. Before we dive into the content, as a good attorney myself, I do have to mention that this presentation is not to be construed as legal advice, right? So what I'm doing today, we're presenting on a topic with the point here is that we want to help you understand an area of the law, in this case about the new Corporate Transparency Act, and your reporting obligations under it. So please, the information not intended to be a substitute for actual professional legal advice about your particular business. And of course, does not create that attorney-client relationship between us as well. All right. All of that administrative piece aside, let's dive into this, right? So first and foremost, what is the Corporate Transparency Act? So the Corporate Transparency Act, you'll hear me refer to it as the CTA. So that's just the abbreviation, the short form of it. This is a new requirement for many businesses to now report information about their beneficial owners. In the presentation later on, I'm going to explain what a beneficial owner is. What does that mean? And by the end of the presentation, I hope you'll have a better understanding of what the new law is, who needs to comply, and what are the consequences, of course, of not doing so. So to give you kind of a high level of why this act came into being, right? I think it's important to understand a background and to understand why the government is sometimes asking us to do certain things. So this law, it was enacted in 2021, went into effect January 1 of this year, 2024. What this law is meant to do is combat certain illegal financial activities. So examples of that are money laundering, terrorist financing, tax evasion. These are the kinds of crimes from a financial perspective that sometimes people, companies create legal entities in the United States to do. So the law, what it intends to do is to increase transparency around who owns all of our legal entities, so that if there is some doubts about the activity of it, the government can do a further investigation about it. So what the law does is establishes a requirement for certain businesses to report information about their owners to a government agency called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. You'll see that abbreviated here in the screen, FinCEN, right? That's a bureau of the Department of Treasury in particular. So again, this is meant to create more transparency around corporate ownership. The intent, we'll see if it actually has the impact that they're intending, is that it's meant to make it harder for criminals to hide their activities behind these shell companies, right, that are created here in the United States. So high level, that is what this law is, essentially why it was enacted and went into effect this year. So speaking of this year and what it means for the law now to be in effect. So a couple of critical dates, right, that we have to keep in mind, especially as those of us that own legal entities. So two critical dates here for legal entities under the Corporate Transparency Act. It's going to depend on when your legal entity was created. So existing companies. So that means if you have a legal entity that was created before January 1st, 2024, those entities, those companies, you have a filing deadline. So a deadline to comply with the law of January 1st, 2025. So you have a year to submit information about your beneficial owners to FinCEN. For entities then that are created on January 1st or later, so these are new entities created this year, those entities, those companies need to file their report within 90 days of receiving notice of their company's registration. Essentially, if you went and you filed for an LLC with the Secretary of State after January 1st this year, you're going to receive some kind of a notice from the Secretary of State when your entity has actually been registered officially. So then that's when your clock starts. It's 90 days from that point in time. So then we have January 1, 2025, that date is important, again, for those entities that were created before Jan 1, 2024. You have until Jan 1, 2025. But also keep in mind that these laws, they're ever changing, right? So right now, there's a 90-day period this year if you create your entity this year. But if you create your entity after Jan 1, 2025, that 90-day period may be shortened to 30 days. That's what we're hearing. But again, stay tuned. It's important to keep on top of these ever-changing dates and modifications to laws. But for now, it's a 90-day period to be able to comply with this. I put a little asterisk here just to remind myself and everyone to mention this. There is no cost to file this beneficial ownership information report, and we'll talk about that report in a little bit, but just want to preemptively just mention that as well. All right, so let's move on. So under the Corporate Transparency Act, there are certain entities that are going to be required to file what's called a beneficial ownership information report. That's the BOI, B-O-I report. So you'll see the BOI kind of acronym in many different places as well. So who actually has to file this report with FinCEN? So here are some categories, right? You've got your traditional corporations, limited liability companies, other similar entities that are formed. This is essentially the piece here. Entities that are formed by filing a document with the Secretary of State. Now, every state in the United States has different entities that you can or cannot file with them, right? So, I mean, universally, most every state is going to have corporations and LLCs. That's going to be every state in the US, but some states has slightly different entities that you can form. So essentially, the guiding principle here is that if you had to send in some kind of a form to the Secretary of State to create your entity, it may be an entity that actually has to file this BOI report. So those are domestic entities. If you have a foreign entity, it means an entity that maybe was created outside of the United States, but you have to register that entity to do business in the United States. That foreign company may also be required to file their BOI report, right? So it doesn't just apply to our US entities that we create here. It also applies if you have foreign non-US entities that you then had to take and register here to do business in the United States. So just something to keep in mind that could apply to you, even if you didn't have to create your entity here in the US. Okay. So under the Corporate Transparency Act, there are, of course, like any law, there are exceptions. There are entities, businesses that are exempted from having to report their beneficial ownership information. So as of today, and again, laws change, there could be updates throughout the course of the year or beyond. As of today, there are about 23 exemptions to who has to actually report their beneficial ownership information. Generally, those companies that don't have to report, generally speaking, they are businesses, they're entities that are already reporting their beneficial owner information to the government in some fashion, right? They may already be required to do that, which is why they don't have to take this step and file this report. So I want to give you just some categories, some examples of certain companies, certain entities that may be exempted from doing these filings, and I'll explain. The ones I've included here are probably the ones that we'll most commonly see among business owners. So just want to make you slightly aware of a couple of the big ticket ones. But again, there are 23 exemptions, which is why I can't go into all 23 here, but I'm going to emphasize this point now. That is why it is important to really do an assessment for your individual business, right? Because depending on what you do as a business owner, what category you fall into, there could be some exemption that may apply to you that we're not going to be mentioning here. All right, but let's quickly, I'm going to name these. So large operating companies, what are they? So these are companies that they have to employ more than 20 full-time employees in the United States, and they have an operating presence, a physical office in the US. So also on top of that, these companies, they have to have filed some income tax information, and they have to show that they have more than 5 million in sales or in gross receipts in a year. So that's why they're called large operating companies, right? These are large corporations, large businesses, and they are exempted from filing this report because most likely they are filing this information with the government about their ownership in different capacities. We've got also publicly traded companies. So these are entities that are already subject to reporting requirements through the SEC. So they're companies that are on the stock exchange. They already have to have submitted some of this information to be a publicly traded company. Tax exempt entities. So think of these like our nonprofit corporations. So these are organizations that have the tax exempt status from the IRS, okay? So those entities, those nonprofits, they may not need to report the BOI information, but a caveat here, right? And something to look into a little further is that there's a difference between getting their IRS tax exemption and being legally a nonprofit corporation, right? So to give you an example, here in Illinois, you can go to the Secretary of State and you can create a non-for-profit corporation. But in order to get that tax exemption from the IRS, you have to take another step. you have to go and apply with the IRS for that tax exempt status. So it begs the question of, if you have a nonprofit that you created, but you haven't taken that step to get the tax exemption, there's some question about whether you fall into this exemption. So if that's the case, I would recommend that you speak with an attorney and really dive into that a little bit further. All right, then a couple of last entities here. So another exempted entity, it's this concept of an inactive entity. So what does it mean to be inactive, right? So sometimes we created entities that we let them sit there, we never use them, you created it years ago. Some of those entities may not have to report their BOI information. So the criteria right now for that is that those entities have to have been in existence, so created before January 1st, 2020. Okay, so this is about 4 years ago, before that time. That means that those companies that were formed after Jan 1, 2020, they probably won't be eligible for this exemption. They'll probably still have to report their BOI ownership. So if I have an entity I created in 2021, I'm probably going to have to come in and report the BOI information, even though I haven't used that entity. Okay, so this may still apply to those entities. There are a few other criteria. If your entity was created on or before Jan 1, 2020, in order to qualify for this exemption. So if you think that you have an entity that could qualify for this, reach out to someone to do a further assessment to see if you fall into the rest of the criteria for this eligibility. And then the last one here, regulated entity. So regulated entity, it's a lot of different examples for that, but just some examples are financial institutions like banks or credit unions, some public utilities companies, other regulated entities that are regulated by the government, probably in some way. They may be exempt as well from filing this BOI report. The bottom line, this is 5 out of 23 possible exemptions, right? So the bottom line is, if you're not sure, if it's not totally clear whether you think you have to report the BOI information, ask, right? You want to confirm and verify, do that assessment for your own business to make sure that even if you think you qualify for an exemption, don't let that thinking and that assumption be the be all end all and make your decision that you don't have to do this reporting. It's better to get that assessment, get the clarity, be sure, because otherwise, if you don't fit actually into this exemption, you don't file your BOI report on time, there are going to be consequences that we'll talk about a little further into the presentation. All right, let us move forward. And also, so any questions too, again, I welcome questions in the chat. If you have any questions, especially about those exemptions, feel free to include them here as well. Otherwise, I'm happy to move forward into the BOI report as well. All right, so we have our BOI report. Maybe we have determined as business owners, as owners of legal entities, that we don't qualify for any of the exemptions. We are going to have to move forward and file information about the beneficial owners of our entities. So, okay, we've made that determination. We feel secure about it. We know we have to move forward and do this. What do we have to do now? So the BOI report, it can be submitted online. So FinCEN has made it accessible. If you look into FinCEN's site, you put BOI report, it'll send you through a few links where you can finally get to the point where you can file that report online. So when you go through and you actually start submitting that information, there are a few things that they're going to ask you for as part of that report. I'm going to preface this, and we'll go into the different things that they will request of you. But I do want to preface that when you go into that report online, you start to submit it. FinCEN actually, I'm pretty surprised, and I'm happy to see that they've done a decent job explaining what it is that they're looking for each question. So if you ever see the report and the question, there's going to be a little circle with a question mark where you can get more information about what is it they're asking me here exactly. So even if after this presentation you're not sure, make sure you utilize that feature on FinCEN's report online as well. All right, but here, let's give you some high level information here for it. So for our entities that exist before, so this is going to be before January 1st, 2024. So these are entities that existed before this year. There's certain information that they're going to ask. This applies to all entities really, but I'm kind of splitting it into two categories that I'll explain momentarily. So for any entity, they're going to ask you, of course, about the company information. So they'll want the legal name of that entity. If you're using any DBAs or assumed names that you filed with the state for your entity, they're going to ask you for that as well. They're going to want the current address, where it was that you formed that entity. So if it's an Illinois entity, it's going to be the state of Illinois. And then they're going to need the taxpayer number for it. So typically your EIN for that legal entity as well. So that's going to apply for whenever you form that entity, that's going to be information that they're going to ask you in that BOI report. Another thing that they're also going to ask any entity is, okay, who are the beneficial owners for those entities? So this is where I'm going to pause and I want to explain, okay, then what does it mean to be a beneficial owner, right? Who is that for a legal entity? So for any entity, what qualifies as a beneficial owner falls into two different categories according to the CTA. So under the CTA, a beneficial owner is an individual, a human, a person who exercises significant influence or control over a legal entity. That is a broad, right, definition. That's subjective to some degree, and it's a case-by-case really assessment for your business and your entity. So that's one piece, right? They exercise significant influence or control over that legal entity. Or they have a substantial ownership stake. So we can break that down a little bit, right? So what does it mean for that first part, what does it mean to have substantial control over your entity? The way that the CTA kind of explains that or defines that is if they have a variety of things, right? They could have authority to maybe appoint or remove management. They have the power to veto some major corporate decisions. They have major voting rights or different, they have different control and ownership, decision-making power over that entity. Again, it's very broad, very gray area. So that's where you especially want to make sure you're doing that review from a case-by-case basis, depending if there's any question for your company, because it's not just about ownership, right? The second piece of that does link to ownership, where you're considered a beneficial owner if you control at least 25%. So in other words, you own at least 25% of that entity. But even if you don't, right? Maybe you have a partner in the business or just the CEO or the CFO or some officer of the business that has no ownership in it, but they have control and make major decisions on behalf of that entity, they may qualify as a beneficial owner as well. So that's what makes this a little complex sometimes to do that assessment business by business, case by case. So if you ever have any questions about who qualifies as a beneficial owner for your entity, make sure you speak to an attorney, speak to someone that can really help you do that legal assessment based on the criteria that the CTA has put out. Okay, so that's what a beneficial owner is under the CTA. So let's say you identify who your beneficial owners are. So then what information do I have to provide for those owners on this report that I'm sending? So a few things they're going to ask you for. They're going to ask you for the legal name, date of birth, the current address, residential address for those people. They're going to want some kind of an identifying number. So examples of that is your driver's license number, your US passport. They also accept passports from other countries as well. And then on top of that, they're going to want to see an image of that ID that you have chosen for the number. So they're going to want a picture, a JPEG or PNG kind of image that you're going to have to upload as well as part of the report. Okay. So that is the information that will be asked for any entity, whether you're created before Jan 1, 2024 or afterward. That's generally the information they're going to ask. For entities that we create Jan 1 of this year, 2024 and beyond, there is an additional category of information they're going to probably request, which is this company applicant information. That's a whole other category as well. So now the question is, who is a company applicant? So what they're going to ask for is they're going to ask for information about the individual or up to 2 people, just depending on what happened, who specifically played a role in forming that new entity. What does that mean? So it means that they want to know who actually created this legal entity with the Secretary of State. So some examples of who a company applicant could be. It could be someone that actually filed that document with the Secretary of State in person or online. So for example, with my clients, I'm a corporate attorney, so sometimes I help my clients create legal entities. If I'm the one that went and I filed that entity on behalf of my client, I would be a company applicant, right? So you would need my information as part of your application if I created that entity for you in Jan 1, 2024 and beyond, okay? Other people that may have done it, the business owner themselves, right? They may have gone and created that entity themselves. They're going to have to submit similar information about themselves as both the company applicant and as the beneficial owner. If there were multiple individuals that were involved in that filing process, maybe someone helped someone else to do it, to complete it, to file it, you may have to do that assessment and see, you may have to name both of those individuals as company applicants on the report as well. So again, very case by case, business by business, depending on how and who created that legal entity is really going to determine who needs to be submitted as a company applicant under the BOI report as well. So key points, right? Just to kind of bring us back, is that there can be, there's going to be a few different items that they may ask you for in this report. What's going to apply to all entities, they're going to need your company information, right? That doesn't matter when you created that entity, that information is going to be requested. No matter when you created the entity, they're going to want to know who is the beneficial owner, and they need that information about those individuals. Company applicant only applies to entities created Jan 1, 2024 and beyond. So as you can see, right, there are so many different categories, so many players involved in this reporting. So I think it is especially critical to, one, you need to understand what are they asking you for, right? Because even within the form, it can get confusing what part is meant to be for who's a company applicant, who's a beneficial owner. It can get a little confusing. And you want to make sure, of course, that the information you're providing is accurate, okay? So, this is very high level, what it is that they're requesting of you, but really it's going to take some time to do this assessment for your individual business, case by case. And then it gets even more complex for those entities that are partnerships that have multiple decision makers, multiple owners. I think that's especially where we're going to see some confusion and some need to do that assessment more in depth for your particular business. All right, so all that being said, any questions about the report, what needs to be included, what they're going to be asking you for? I know I just said a lot of information there, so let me know, of course. I'm monitoring the chat if you have any specific questions on that. Okay, so I think, Michael, you may have control over that, but no problem. Let's move into, I think, the less one of the more important parts, right, is why do we actually need to comply with this? What are the consequences of potentially not doing so? So there absolutely are penalties for non-compliance under the CTA. They can be quite significant, as you see here. So the breakdown is here in front of us, right? So failing to file or inaccurately filing information can lead to certain penalties. So a company could face penalties of up to $500 per day for each day that you, one, have not filed this report, or two, the information that you filed is incorrect. I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but there is what's called a safe harbor, meaning that if there's like a 30 and 90-day grace period, just depending on the kind of inaccuracy, that if you hadn't realized that you had put inaccurate information, then you realize it and you have knowledge of it, you have a certain number of days to go in and correct it before you start incurring these penalties as well. So something to know that there is that protection there. But otherwise, if you know some of the information you put in there is wrong, or if you haven't done it, there is this potential up to $500 a day penalty for that. On top of that, there are criminal penalties associated with it. So if someone willfully is not complying, meaning they know that they provided false information, wrong information, they know that they need to do this, they haven't been doing this, even if they don't know that, that's the issue too. A lot of business owners don't know that this is a new requirement, a new law. It doesn't matter, right? Even so, you will be subject to these penalties for not complying. The criminal side, it's up to two, actually it's probably up to 2 years in prison. So, and 5 I think is inaccurate, which we'll need to update. So I think as of now, it's up to 2 years in prison and additional potential fines for those criminal penalties associated with that. Now, will they enforce this? Will there actually be these penalties? Will they be put in place? I don't know, right? It hasn't happened yet because, I haven't seen any cases of it yet. But that doesn't mean that you want to be the test case for it, right? You do not want to be the guinea pig, I hope, for seeing if they're actually going to enforce these penalties. Filing these reports, doing this, it's free, right? So we can go online, submit this information at no cost to us. So my recommendation generally, let's get it done. Let's not wait and see, right? If we're going to be enforcing certain penalties that they have put out there. Beyond the criminal penalties, the potential monetary penalties associated with this, there can be other considerations for not doing this. So some examples are non-compliance. There could be a flag placed on your company's report. I don't know to what extent, right? But there could be some just public information that this isn't done. If somebody needs to check in on this, could hinder some ability to do business with certain entities if you're not in compliance with certain laws. We think of reputational damage sometimes too. If we're not complying with laws that are applicable to our entities and our businesses, it could raise some concerns, of course, of why we're not complying with laws, why we are not keeping up to date with the corporate governance requirements for our legal entities. So I think it's important to avoid that as well. So I'm going to mention this quickly because maybe now the more you learn about the Corporate Transparency Act, the more you may see information, news about it as well. So there have been some recent court decisions that have been casting some doubt on whether the Corporate Transparency Act is constitutional or not. There have been a couple of rulings in place where one business in particular was not required to do their filing. So they won their case, but the CTA made it very clear that all other businesses still have to do their reporting. I say this to mention that there could be changes, there could be movement, right, around the CTA. It's uncertain how this law is going to be enforced in the future, what other lawsuits and other things are going to come up because of the Corporate Transparency Act. There are going to be more court decisions. There's going to be more pushback on the law, probably in the months to come, especially. My recommendation, though, personally, is that do your filing regardless, right? It's not worth waiting to see how different lawsuits turn out or how somebody is going to rule on it. Think better to comply with the laws that exist and making sure that we're getting our requirements done on time, depending on when we are required to do so based on when we created our legal entities. All right, so a couple of last points here. So the BOI report, it is a one-time thing. So meaning we don't have to renew it annually, except for a couple of scenarios here. So you have your initial report that you're going to have to do, and you may have to make changes in the future to either correct the information that you submitted originally or to add more information if things change or happen in the future. So you'll see it when you go and file your BOI report online. It gives you the option. Is this an initial report? Is it a corrected report? Is it an updated report as well. So you'll see that you have different options to choose there. So just quickly, high level, what's the difference between an updated report and maybe a corrected report? So an updated report, you'll probably file that if there are changes to the information that you had already submitted under the BOI report. So maybe there's a change in beneficial owners, right? Maybe you added a new owner, maybe somebody has new decision-making power, someone owns now more than the 20 or the 25% or more that didn't before. These are updates then that you're going to have to make to your company's report. Maybe there's a change in company information. Now you have an updated office space, an updated address that you have to go in and update with the report, et cetera, right? Those are some examples of when you may need to create an updated report. So now, sometimes there need to be corrections, right? Maybe you find that you had actually put wrong information. There was an error in something that you put in, even a misspelling, a slight grammar, like just a small text error, that then you would go in and probably file a corrected BOI report when you have discovered that that error exists. So like I mentioned before, if you were not aware that there was an error, but then you discover that there is, well, you're not in compliance with the law, right? Because there's incorrect information. The law, though, does give you some leeway, 30, 90 days, depending on what those corrections are that you need to make, gives you that time to go in, make those corrections from the moment that you discovered that those inaccuracies, those errors existed. So just, something to keep in mind, that there is some grace period there as well. So that, honestly, that is the information at a very high level that I do have regarding the Corporate Transparency Act, your reporting obligations, some considerations too of what kinds of analyses are you going to have to do for your own business. So a lot of it, especially for business owners that have, like I said, partners, or they have decision makers that may not be owners, those are the businesses, in my opinion, that will have more analysis to do. There are going to be more questions and complexity. Even those right now that have been created Jan 1 of this year and beyond, they're entities that also have to now think about who was truly the applicant, who put in this application. Did someone else do it on my behalf? We're going to want to make sure then that we need the information and get the information from those applicants to put into our reports as well. So just quickly, so I'm a corporate attorney, so, have been working with businesses, entrepreneurs, particularly on their BOI reporting, helping them do that assessment, making sure we're putting the right information on those reports. Otherwise, we're here supporting entrepreneurs and businesses in contracts, creating entities, corporate governance, anything and everything. As laws change and are updated, we're here to support our businesses in that way and make sure that your practices are actually setting you up for success and compliance with the law over time. So contact information is here. I know, Michael, you're going to share some contact information about the IHCC as well. They're a phenomenal resource as well to point you in the right direction as changes happen. But otherwise, I haven't seen any questions. So I do welcome those if there are any questions here. Otherwise, just a quick note that I do offer a free 15-minute discovery call. So more than happy to have those conversations, be a resource however I can. But hopefully you've learned more about the CTA BOI reporting requirements, why you should not hold off on doing it, potential sanctions, penalties for not doing so. So yeah, let us know if you need any additional information on that. So Michael, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Noeli. Wonderful presentation, a lot of great information, and you're absolutely right. There's not a lot of business owners out there that are informed on this specific topics, and that's why we're here, right? So on top of that, as I mentioned before, a big part of the Cook County Small Business Source Program, which is only one of 9 programs we have at the Illinois Hispanic Chamber of Commerce that are aimed to help out entrepreneurs and small business owners, right? You can contact us if you're interested in advising or scheduling a one-on-one business advising session. We have just on the Cook County program, we have 4 advisors, including myself, 2 of which that specialize in marketing, whether it be traditional marketing, more of a broader sense of marketing, and those that that are more specific to digital marketing as well as small business development. So if you're a startup, you're looking to register your business and all that good stuff, we're here to provide the technical assistance to help you out. And once again, don't be shy to ask questions. So this webinar was recorded, and we're hoping to have that posted up on our YouTube page, our Instagram, and our LinkedIn for you to check it out in case you want to do a little quick recap and kind of refresh on the topic. And outside of that, just to stay up to date with all that's going on with the IHCC, whether it be workshops, webinars, or awesome networking events, I invite you all to check out our website at ihccbusiness.net or look us up on our platforms. Like I mentioned before, we're on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. We're happy to help. Don't be shy. We're here to support you. I'm just going to double check one more time to see if there's any questions in the chat. I am not seeing anything. So as for now, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy days to be with us here today. And if you have any questions, please don't feel scared to reach out. We're here to support. Thank you guys so much and have a beautiful day.